Hey Jews, welcome to the final, chapter here in the book of Esther, where today we're going to finish reading the Megillah, basically, and with the help of Rabbi Yaakov Kuli, who compiled all of the different levels of the meaning of what we're reading, so we'll understand our reality. We're at the end of time. It's the year 5785, and even just by reading the book of Esther this year and learning it in this way has helped me gain a higher understanding of our reality, because I can really see the similarities in the story. And we know that in the Torah, the stories repeat themselves. And that's just part of our holidays, really, for us to remember our whole history as Jews and remember the Torah, and that the Creator gave us the Torah. He loves us. We are a nation, a holy nation. We have different laws that we live by, and all that happened to us throughout time, and that there will be a time when we will no longer be scattered amongst the nations. We will reestablish this connection by having a God conscious awareness, meaning having an experience when all of us on the physical level will have an experience, Bezrat Hashem, of God as it's taught us in the Torah, as we relate to the Creator of the universe in the Torah, which is what we learn, so that we can have knowledge to base our belief system on, and to have faith in that knowledge that is based in wisdom. There's only the physical reality can we base our understanding just on experience, or just on things that we can experience physically, things that we can see, feel, hear, taste, and experience, and therefore know. So we gain a higher level of understanding of our reality when we incorporate the very, very important elements of our reality, which are the spiritual element and the time element. And in fact, time is so important that it is, in Hebrew, makes up the name of God, that we specifically use that name. And it is a combination of the past, the present, and the future in Hebrew. And we want to basically get to a moment where we all understand and know and understand, based on the wisdom, things that we know. Our knowledge will be an experience of God, like we all had once. We had this experience. All our forefathers had this experience collectively when they stood and accepted the Torah laws at Har Sinai. And that's the time in our calendar that we need to remember that, and that is in Pesach, Passover. So we read in the Megillah in the last video that Mordechai wanted us to remember something else for all of time. He wanted us to remember and have in our conscious minds to remember that we all experienced this together, just like we all experienced COVID. We can now talk about COVID together amongst ourselves because we all experienced that together. So we have this understanding. We know that the knowledge that we have, we're all being witnesses one for each other. So in 3,000 years, if we make it a point to pass down what we learned, what we came to understand about our reality, so to our children and to their children's children, so that they would just know. They would just know that it was so. They would just know that there was a lockdown, a worldwide lockdown. They would know that there was information control. And that's when we all realized that we may be believing in the wrong thing. And then we also all experience together October 7th. We all can understand that our belief that we placed in the IDF, if whoever placed their belief in the IDF or the state, that it would save the Jews from another Holocaust, that did not happen. So we understand that. And the people who have a higher understanding of reality based on the wisdom that incorporates the spiritual and the time, understand what's happening. We are at the end of time, the time element. We're very, very close to the end of time. So what we need to remember about Purim was the situation around them at the time, which was that there was a very high rise in anti-Semitism all over the world. And on a spiritual level, we're told basically that was God signaling to his nation that after they were exiled from the first temple, when the first temple was destroyed and they were exiled to Babylon, and they ended up there under the rule of Persia, Ahasuerus, that God was trying to awaken them and also at the same time show them their neighbors, show them that in exile the people are anti-Semitic. And so it brought to the surface, we read there in the book of Esther, it became known to everybody. We all now are experiencing together what they probably experienced during the Holocaust and leading up to the Holocaust. They were all witnessing that together. Just like we witnessed the revelation of God. And we pass that down from generation to generation, just like we will pass down our experiences, hopefully, to the next generation. We'll all say, remember when they tried to make us confirm that a man can have a baby? And that you could go to jail if you said that a man could not have a baby? So we need to make sure, again, that what we believe in or where we're putting our faith is something that we can count on. And we're told over and over and over and over again in the Torah, and especially at the end times, that this is our rock and our foundation forever, for all of time. That this connection, even if we don't understand it here or here, we don't see it, we don't feel it, we don't understand it, because we don't understand how could there also be a Holocaust and how could there be an October 7th, and also God. But when we do start understanding, that we're at the end of time. And if we look around us, the situation looks very similar to that we had just read in this series of the book of Esther. Very anti-Semitic. Some people were already starting to kill Jews in certain areas. And it was like what they were given the right to do, though, was to defend themselves. So, and then we saw that they ended up defending themselves and killing their enemies. So the one thing that they tell us again was that the fact that the decree from Haman went out and people knew about it, and it brought to the level their anti-Semitism. They were no longer hiding it, or it was no longer repressed. It became known to everybody, and that's exactly also what happened to us. Since October 7th, all our enemies have been unmasked. We now can clearly see what perhaps they failed to see because they didn't have the experience ever before. But we have their information. We now have learned, hopefully, a little bit about some of the things about the Holocaust, like how the neighbors turned on them Then they stole their businesses, they stole their property, which we see that was in the decree of Haman, that they were going to kill the Jews and take their property. And that is what they did in the Holocaust. And that is what they want to do in every generation. And in Purim, it was the opposite. The Jews were allowed to kill them and take their property, although Mordecai, the Jew, who became like the leader, also in the government of Ahasuerus's kingdom. And so Mordecai did not allow the Jews, and none of the Jews took any of the property. So we have Purim, we have the Holocaust, and we have our current situation. We have October 7th. What are all these things have in common? A lot. So the interesting thing is now we have a comparison of what to do. When the Jews all united and fasted and prayed to God on the 13th of Adar, which this year is March 13th, God saved them. God saved them. And in a way, when we think about the Holocaust and how we also, after the Holocaust, did come to the land of Israel, in a way, it was a little bit similar. So maybe it also was a little bit like a Purim, unrevealed miracle, that we did come to the land of Israel and we did live here in peace for a while, kind of, but not really. A lot of Jews, since the formation of the state of Israel, have died, and I heard an estimate that it was like, if it was like 1 Jew a day, if you spread out like all the Jews that died in the land of Israel since the formation of the state, it was like 1 Jew per year. That's all the wars and all the terrorist attacks and all the things. Like, Jews are the least safe here in the land of Israel. And as we can see, because of all that goes on here in the land of Israel, it has caused anti-Semitism to rise all over the world. So, I mean, not a lot of Jews also came back to the land of Israel. So again, what we saw in Purim time and in the book of Ezra, not a lot of Jews left exile to go back. And these were Jews that had lived in the time of the first temple. They still had prophets among them. And now in our times, I mean, we are so far removed from this awareness, from this type of understanding of our reality. There was a time in the first temple that our understanding of reality was so very whole and objective, and we had a high level of spiritual awareness and a high consciousness. And at the first level, the first temple, then that level allowed us to perceive, even on a physical level, miracles, like trees that gave golden fruit. And now to us, that seems like a fantasy or like whatever. But because we don't even understand, even the fact that we see actual fruit is a miracle. The fact that the way that everything was designed to work in our reality is intelligent. So that's what we should understand. We should understand that we should do what they did in Purim. We should all unite. We should all make sure that we do our best and just get the end of our story, which is the redemption, just like in Purim, but just like it is foretold that we will repent and God will save us. And we don't have to keep experiencing reality as Jews in exile, but rather we could experience our reality as Jews with the temple and feel secure in our land and feel cared for, like we read about, like we say we want. So we don't want to stay in exile. We don't want to stay in exile also spiritually, where we don't perceive the correct reality, which is a miracle. Everything's a miracle. Baruch Hashem. So we continue, and hopefully we will finish. Is that what you guys are understanding? Okay, 9:23. The Jews accepted what they had already begun, and Mordechai had written to them. The Jews had already begun to observe Purim on their own, and they wanted to keep it every year when Mordechai sent messages that this had been formally legislated, put into law by the rabbis, but for a good reason, not just because the rabbis took over, but because the rabbis understood what they were doing. All of the rabbis of the Talmud understood what they were doing. So we're not smarter than them. The Jews had already begun to observe Purim on their own, and they wanted to keep it every year. When Mordechai sent messages that this had been formally legislated, they were pleased and readily accepted it as an obligation. They also accepted Mordechai's new legislation, sending portions to friends and gifts to the poor, as well as obligations of reading the Megillah. At first, many Jews were annoyed with Mordechai. They felt that he had been to blame for their troubles because he had not bowed down to Haman. Now, however, they realized that the entire drama had been directed by providence. And their troubles could not be blamed on Mordechai. They therefore honored Mordechai all the more and were willing to accept these things merely because Mordechai had legislated them. 9:24 and 25. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, enemy of the Jews, had plotted to exterminate the Jews and had cast the poor, which is like a dice, to find a lucky day, to crush and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he said in writing that Haman's wicked plot against the Jews should boomerang on his own head, and they hanged him and his sons on the gallows. The Jews realized that Haman was the arch enemy of the Jews and not of Mordechai alone. Therefore, they had no reason to blame Mordechai for their troubles. The Great Assembly wanted to make Purim a permanent holiday. A holiday cannot be legislated, however, unless the Jews as a whole accept it. There was concern that the Jews might not want to accept any permanent holiday. They might take Haman's actions as a personal vendetta against Mordechai, into which all Jews had been drawn. Perhaps the innocent children would have been spared in the end, and the Jews of the people would have survived. Mordechai therefore sent missives to all of the Jews explaining how Haman was an enemy of all the Jews. If he had his way, every single Jew, adult and child alike, would have been exterminated, and the Jews as a whole would have been annihilated. The miracle was therefore not only for that generation, but for all generations to come. Do we see a little bit now what our reality is wanting to do? To even kill babies, as we saw, so that no future generations of Jews would be in the existence, just like we would not be in existence right now if Purim didn't go the way it went, or the Holocaust. At least there still was Jews left in the world. So same in every generation. So every subsequent generation from that event, we owe our existence only because we know what happened. The Jews realized, they realized about Amalek, the arch enemy, which we are commanded to go and listen and remember Amalek. That's a commandment. We say it every day, also one of the 10 things we say, so that we will remember Amalek, that in every generation they want to annihilate us. So Mordechai sent missives to all the Jews explaining how Haman was an enemy of all the Jews And Purim is also different than all the other holidays in that there is a special scroll that must be read on that day. Other holidays commemorate well-defined miracles. In the case of Purim, however, the entire story is replete with miracles. It was a miracle of coincidences and poetic justice from the beginning to the end, and it can only be appreciated when the entire story is read. And when we understand the intricacies of what was happening there and how many times Providence was the one leading everything, and it was a twist upon a twist that we couldn't have seen coming. Just like all of the story of the Jews. All of the story of the Jews. And that's why we're told also that Abraham and Sarah named their son Yitzchak, which is like the present, the future tense of laugh. Yitzchak. To laugh in the present is tzchok. But they named their one child that they gave all of the lineage to, basically, or the blessing, and is Yitzchak. And so we're told that means also that at the end, basically, what's going to happen is when we enter into the third temple with God and with the whole nation after the redemption and after the resurrection of all of the Jews that lived, that because of them we even got to this point, and we still are Jews because they transmitted the information, they transmitted the wisdom and the understanding of that wisdom and the knowledge, so that that's how we survived all this time. So they'll be resurrected, and then we'll all go into the temple and we will cry. And we will cry for everything that happened. We will cry for the times that we were separated from our God and from each other as a nation. And then we will laugh. We will laugh. Yitzchak. It's going to be funny somehow that we don't understand yet. So we can only know all of how complicated the story was by learning it. So 9:26 to 28. Therefore they called these days Purim, from the word pur, because of all that was in this letter they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews established it and accepted it upon themselves, upon their children, and upon all those who would join them, not to be changed, that they would keep these 2 days as written at the same time each year. These days will be remembered and kept in each generation, in every family, land, and city. These days of Purim will never be abandoned by the Jews, nor shall their memory die out amongst their children. These verses answer two logical questions that one may ask about Purim. First, why was the festival named after the pool or lot that Haman had cast? This was the decree against the Jews, not their deliverance. Second, the true deliverance from Haman occurred on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Passover, when Haman was hanged. Why was Purim celebrated on the 13th of Adar? It is not at all difficult for God to perform miracles. At this time, however, the Jews were in exile because of their sins and did not deserve a miracle. The deliverance would therefore have to be circumscribed by the limbs of nature. The miracle of Purim, therefore, had the appearance of a total natural event. No laws of nature were broken. Esther was queen, and it was perfectly logical for her to be able to overcome her enemy. If there was a miracle, it was one of coincidences, meaning it wasn't obvious. It wasn't very obvious. But Haman had chosen the 13th of Adar carefully. It was a day upon which the Jews had absolutely no special merit. All of the astrological signs and portents had shown it to be a perfect day to destroy the Jews. God, however, changed the situation completely. Not only were the Jews not killed on Adar 13th, but they experienced their greatest triumph. This was also one of the coincidences of Purim. If Haman had chosen Nisan or another month that was propitious for the Jews, the miracle of Purim would not have been as obvious. But it fell in Adar, the most unpropitious month of the year for the Jew. Therefore, when the Jews were delivered, it was obvious to all that God had intervened for them. This explains why the festival was named after the poor. It also explains why it is not celebrated on the 16th of Nisan, the day upon which Haman was hanged. Nisan is a month of Passover, a most auspicious month for the Jew. The fact that an enemy of the Jew met his downfall in Nisan was not particularly surprising. But the real miracle was that the Jews were able to defeat their enemies in Adar, their least auspicious month. This also helps to clarify another difficulty. Many miracles occurred for the Jews throughout the ages. Many times enemies wanted to exterminate the Jews, and they were saved only at the last minute. Why is only Purim celebrated with a festival? There was something special about Purim. Besides being delivered physically, the Jews were also delivered spiritually at this time. They accepted God's Torah wholeheartedly without any reservations. Seeing the tremendous spiritual renaissance that this miracle produced, the sages felt that it should be commemorated by a special festival. Although the Jews had accepted the Torah on Shavuot when it was given at Sinai, they were actually under duress at that time. Their lives were in God's hands, and they knew it. If they did not accept the Torah, they knew that their graves would be right there in the desert. But on the first Purim, the Jews were already victorious and under no duress. In the midst of their greatest celebration, they reaffirmed their acceptance of the Torah without reservation. God promised that even if the other festivals will be annulled in the Messianic age, Purim will still be kept. On Purim, God forgives the sin of the Jews just as on Yom Kippur. One must therefore be careful not to throw off the yoke of heaven, even during the most exuberant Purim celebrations. Be modest, be respectful, be humble. Make sure you can get up in the morning and pray. Don't get too drunk. 9:29. Queen Esther, daughter of Avichail, and Mordechai, the Jew, wrote with full authority confirming the second letter of Purim. When Mordechai and Esther saw that all the Jews had agreed to keep Purim as a holiday, they bound them by an oath that they would never annul it. This festival will be kept even when the Jews were in trouble. Even when the Jews were in trouble. We saw last year, after October 7th, the rabbis of our generation, who are not good rabbis, they told us to not celebrate. Don't celebrate too much on Purim because that's disrespectful to the family of the hostages and whatnot. So they annulled this basically. It's crazy how misled we are at this point. And we have to know that. So lost my place now. So it's a tremendous spiritual, so seeing the tremendous spiritual renaissance that this miracle produced, the sages felt that it should be commemorated by a special festival. And in the midst of the greatest celebration, they reaffirmed their acceptance of God without reservation. God promised that even if other festivals would be annulled, that this would be kept, and that also we have to make sure that even it would be kept even in times when the Jews are in trouble. So we should always be happy and festive and have a festival no matter what's happening in our reality. The oath exacted by a monarch is extremely severe. Therefore, Esther was not satisfied with what Mordechai had done. To Mordechai's authority, she added the authority of the Persian Empire. In essence, however, her decree was the same as that of Mordechai. It was important that the legislation regarding Purim be reinforced by an oath. Purim celebrates the triumph of the Jews over the Gentiles, and in future times, the Jews might be afraid to celebrate it. In times of persecution, they might consider it as an inappropriate celebration. There was sufficient reason for such worry. When Mordechai first sent out missives instructing the Jews to keep Purim, many had answered that it might be dangerous, since it could cause Gentiles to hate them. Mordechai replied that the reason for Purim was well known, that it was even written in the official chronicles of the Persians and the Medes. Mordechai's second letter to the Jews gave them the courage to keep the festival. This reassurance was also included in the letter that Mordechai and Esther sent to all of the Jews. Esther also wrote the sages that they should make reading the Megillah a permanent obligation, and that it should be written exactly like the Torah scroll. Again, they replied that they were afraid that it might cause the Gentiles to hate them. Esther replied that the entire story was already in the official histories, and including that including it in the Holy Scripture would not have any adverse effects. Again, you can go and look at Mordechai and Queen Esther's grave in Iran. This is all part of their history. This is where, like, if we learned the actual history of reality, we would know this from history. So that this is all, so anyway, so we should never cancel the celebration, no matter what's happening in our actual time and reality. Esther also wrote the sages that they should make reading the Megillah the permanent obligation. And finally, Esther explained that writing the story of how the Jews defeated the Hammonites was included in the obligation to remember the nefarious deeds of the Amalekites. In the case of Amalek, the Torah itself says, write it in a book in Exodus 17:14. Since a commandment of the Torah was involved, no concern could be given to what the Gentiles would think. The sages concurred and also attested that the book of Esther was written with prophetic inspiration, Ruach HaKodesh. Esther had a good personal reason to want the story preserved. She had married a Gentile, which normally would be considered a major sin. But when people read the entire story, they will realize that her act had been guided by providence. She therefore wanted the entire story to be included in the scripture. 9:30 and 31. He sent scrolls to all the Jews in 127 lands of Ahasuerus' kingdom, words of peace and truth, to keep these days of Purim at the right time, just as Mordechai, the Jew, and Queen Esther had established it, and just as they and their children had accepted the order to fast and pray. The message began with words of peace, like all letters. Although there was a difference between walled cities and unwalled towns, both were to respect the days of the other. Thus, for example, although the unwalled towns celebrate Purim on the 14th, they are also to keep the 15th as a minor holiday. This is usually referred to as Shushan Purim. Mordechai also instructed the Jews not to abandon the study of Torah. It was because of this neglect that the persecution had come, and in the merit of the children who studied Torah and the Jews were saved. Mordechai stressed to the Jews that they were to adhere to the truth of the Torah. Have faith in that. Adhere to this. This is the truth. Base your belief system on the truth. Mordechai also, the order to fast mentioned here alludes to the Fast of Esther, which has been discussed earlier, and that's March 13th, the 13th of Adar, where we're all going to fast and pray to God. So Purim is also a special time for prayer. Especially beneficial is the recitation of Psalms, Tehillim. If one looks at the original Hebrew of "and on their children," the order to fast, one sees that the final word spells out Tehillim. The final letters spell out Tehillim, the Hebrew word for Psalms. 9:32. Esther's, so meaning fast, pray to God and read Tehillim if you can. Read Psalms. Sorry about that. Okay, 9:32. Esther's words confirmed these rules for Purim, and it was written in a scroll. It was actually Esther who pressed to have Purim celebrated on the 14th of Dar. Many of the sages wanted to establish it on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Passover, since Haman had been hanged on that day. Esther, however, argued that if Purim coincided with Passover, its observance would not be obvious. Esther had reasons for wanting Purim to be obvious. She therefore argued that it should be established on a day that was not another holiday. Also, we're not allowed to have two smechot on the same time. We're not allowed. We shouldn't. You should celebrate each thing in its own right. The sages also agreed to allow the story in a scroll and include it in the scripture. They even agreed to allow it to be written on parchment, just like a Torah scroll. And since Esther had risked her life for her people, it would be known as Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther. Even the Jews in Africa, which was not part of the Persian Empire, decided to keep Purim. They realized that the entire Jewish people is like a single body. When one part of the body is injured, the entire body suffers. Therefore, even Jews from far from the Persian Empire felt obliged to celebrate the great deliverance of their brethren. Just like we saw so many Jews that came from all over the world to fight physically with the IDF for the Jews. But now we need everyone to gather spiritually and pray for our salvation, for the redemption. So they realized that the entire Jewish people is like a single body. And this was a great lesson that Esther had taught the Jews. When she told Mordecai to go and gather all the Jews, she had stressed the need for unity. It was the same spirit of unity that caused all the Jews, even outside the Persian Empire, to celebrate Purim. And we today are still celebrating Purim. And let this be the last one that we do as Jews that are scattered, as Jews that are not united, as Jews that have not yet been redeemed. We can unite, we can fast, we can pray, we can say Tehillim, Psalms. Say them out loud, out of your mouth. On that day, cry out to God. Say the Shma Yisrael. Listen, go and listen to the Megillat Esther. Listen. It's going to be read from a scroll like a Torah. Bezrat Hashem. We will see miracles. And I didn't finish. I have one more chapter, I guess. But so hopefully we'll get there. I think we will before the March 13th, so we can understand and do this with a lot of conscious effort and awareness and intention to reconnect as a nation on a spiritual level at this time.